Hi friends, I welcome you all here at TNV Academy. In this session, we are going to talk about an international standard ISO 37001 2016. Let's start with the clause 4 context of the organization of ISO 37001 2016 now. Clause 4 of ISO 37001 2016 has 5 sub clauses which are 4.1 Understanding the organization and its context. 4.2 Understanding the needs and expectations of stakeholders. 4.3 Determining the scope of the anti-bribery management system. 4.4 Anti-Bribery Management System. 4.5 Bribery Risk Assessment. Let me start with the subclause 4.1 Understanding the organization and its context. According to the subclause 4.1 of ISO 37001 2016, the standard states that the organization must determine external and internal issues that are relevant to its purpose and that affect its ability to achieve the objective of its anti-bribery management system. Let us talk here about the external and internal contexts. This requirement of clause 4.1 can seem too general, and there is a threat of going too wide when defining the internal and external issues. In fulfilling this clause, organizations should emphasize only on issues that can affect the consumer satisfaction and delivery of quality products and or services. An organization's internal context is the environment in which it targets to achieve its objectives. Internal context can include its approach to governance, its contractual relationships with customers, and its interested parties. Things that need to be considered are related to culture, philosophies, ethics, or ideologies inside the organization, as well as complexity of processes and organizational structure. To determine external context, organization should consider issues arising from its social, technological, environmental, ethical, political, legal, and economic environment. Some examples of external context may include government regulations and changes in the law, economic shifts in the organization's market, the organization's competition, events that may affect corporate image, changes in technology, etc. Basically, all this information is with the top and other senior members of management, but it is usually not written on paper. The best way to gather it is by organizing some brainstorming sessions. Arrangement of all this information can be very valuable and validate where you stand as an organization. We should include some of the internal context as well, but are not limited to. Some of the examples of internal issues are structure of the organization, which has limited flexibility when dealing with varying demands. Availability of reliable, qualified, and competent workforce, which is very positive. Stability of workforce, where wage benchmarking is not consistent with competitors. Staff retention, which is also very high positive. Contractual arrangements with customer, which is beneficial to organization. Payment terms from customers provides high credit. Solvency of customers and expansion of customer base also play an important role. The culture within the organization is equally important internal factor. Coming back to the clause 4.1, this clause says that these internal and external issues will include, without limitation, important factors like the size, structure, and delegated decision-making authority of the organization, and the locations and sectors in which the organization operates or anticipates operating. Subclause 4.1 specifies that issues will comprise of the nature, scale, and complexity of the organization's activities and operations, and also the business model of the organization. This clause states that the organization must include entities over which the organization has control and entities which exercise control over the organization while determining the internal and external issues. According to subclause 4.1, the organization must contain organization's business associates, the nature and extent of interactions with public officials while determining external and internal issues. Clause specifies that organization must include applicable statutory, regulatory, contractual, and professional obligations and duties while determining the issues. Clause 4.1 stresses through a note and that an organization has control over another organization if it directly or indirectly controls the management of the organization. Let's talk about subclause 4.2, understanding the needs and expectations of stakeholders. The subclause 4.2 states that the organization must determine the stakeholders that are relevant to the anti-bribery management system and the relevant requirements of these stakeholders. The definition of stakeholders is already explained under clause 3 of the standard. Some of the examples of stakeholders are customers, employees, governments, investors, shareholders, suppliers, and vendors, etc. Let me explain the subclause 4.2. The clause 4.2 of ISO 37001 2016 states that the organization must determine relevant stakeholders and relevant requirements of appropriate concerned parties. Relevant interested parties to be considered are those that could affect or potentially affect the organization's ability to constantly provide products and services that meet customer and applicable statutory and regulatory requirements. Monitor and review information related to interested parties and relevant requirements. Firstly, the organization will need to define external and internal issues that are relevant to its purpose. That is, what are the relevant issues, both inside and out, that have an influence on what the organization does, that would affect its capability to accomplish the intended outcomes of its management system. It should be noted that the term issue covers not only problems which would have been the subject of the precautionary action in previous standards, but also important topics for the management system to address, such as any market assurance and governance goals that the organization might set for its management system. Next, the organization has to determine relevant interested parties and relevant requirements of relevant interested parties. An interested party is a person or organization that can be affected by, or recognize themselves to be affected by a decision or activity that's within the scope of the management system. There will be those external interested parties that enforce specific legal, regulatory, or contractual requirements in an organization. There may also be requirements specified by internal interested parties, for example, management and staff, permanent and temporary. There is no requirement in this international standard for the organization to consider interested parties which have been determined by the organization not to be relevant to its anti-bribery management system. Similarly, there is no requirement to address a particular requirement of a relevant interested party if the organization considers that the requirement is not relevant. Determining what is relevant or not relevant is reliant on whether or not it has an impact on the organization's ability to regularly provide products and services that meet customer and applicable statutory and regulatory requirements, or the organization's aim to improve consumer satisfaction. The organization can decide to determine supplementary needs and expectations that will assist it to meet its service objectives. However, it is at the organization's choice whether or not to accept additional requirements to satisfy interested parties beyond what is required by this international standard, ISO 37001 2016. At the end, Clause 4.2 stresses under a note that in identifying the requirements of stakeholders, an organization can distinguish between mandatory requirements and the non mandatory expectations of and voluntary commitments to stakeholders. Let me now explain the subclause 4.3. Determining the scope of the anti-bribery management system of ISO 37001-2016. The subclause 4.3 states that the organization must determine the boundaries and applicability of the anti-bribery management system to establish its scope. This clause says that an organization, while determining this scope, must consider the external and internal issues referred to in Clause 4.1, the requirements referred to in Clause 4.2, and the results of the bribery risk assessment referred to in Clause 4.5 of the standard. The subclause 4.2 also specifies that the organization must make available the scope and must maintain scope as documented information stating the services covered by the ABMS and any justification where a requirement of this international standard cannot be applied. Further, it is also stressed in subclause 4.3 of the standard under a note to refer annexure A2 for further guidance. Let's discuss the subclause 4.4 of ISO 37001-2016, which is Anti-Bribery Management System. Subclause 4.4 of ISO 37001-2016 states that the organization must establish, document, implement, maintain, and continually review and, where necessary, improve an anti-bribery management system, including the processes needed and their interactions in accordance with the requirements of this document. This clause further states that the anti-bribery management system must contain measures designed to identify and evaluate the risk of and to prevent, detect, and respond to bribery. It is also specified under Note 1 of the subclause 4.4 that it is not possible to completely eliminate the risk of bribery, and no anti-bribery management system will be capable of preventing and detecting all bribery. This clause 4.4 also says that the anti-bribery management system must be reasonable and proportionate, taking into account the factors referred to in subclause 4.3 of the standard ISO 37001-2016. Finally, under Note 2, subclause 4.4 recommends to refer the annexure A.3 for further guidance. Coming to the subclause 4.5 bribery risk assessment. The subclause 4.5.1 states that the organization must undertake regular bribery risk assessment, which must identify the bribery risks the organization might reasonably anticipate, given the factors listed in subclause 4.1 of the standard. It must analyze, assess, and prioritize the identified bribery risks and must evaluate the suitability and effectiveness of the organization's existing controls to mitigate the assessed bribery risks. The subclause 4.5.2 specifies that the organization must establish criteria for evaluating its level of bribery risk, which must take into account the policies and objectives of the organization. As per subclause 4.5.3, the organization must review the bribery risk assessment on a regular basis so that changes and new information could be properly assessed based on timing and frequency defined by the organization. Organization must also review the bribery risk assessment in the event of a significant change to the structure or activities of the organization. The subclause 4.5.4 of ISO 37001-2016 states that the organization must retain documented information that demonstrates that the bribery risk assessment has been conducted and used to design or improve the anti-bribery management system. At the end of clause 4.5.4, standard recommends to refer annexure A.4 for further guidance. I sincerely thank you for all your interest and attention. Thanks and best wishes.